1941, you'll perhaps recall that the war was well on, and England was more than occupied with the battle for Britain. Japs had come into the war, and the Yanks weren't yet in the war. And the Japs started to advance south at that point in time, at the end of 1941. They were coming south pretty fast. And somewhere about middle of November 41, two British battleships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, were sunk by Japanese dive bombers right off the east coast of Malaya. And this was a horrifying thing because those battleships were all that stood between Australia and the Japs. Anyway, I came to work that morning fairly early, and my boss was a fellow named Fred David, a Butte bloke, and he came into work that morning early too, and we'd both horrified by the news we just heard about these battleships being sunk. He was so upset that he was sitting at his desk, which was close to mine, and he was weeping. So I walked over and sat on a stool next to him and tried to console him a bit, talk to him a bit, and waited for him to dry his tears, which he did after a time. I think I shed a few tears myself. Anyway, after quite a few minutes, he turned to me and said, "Design a fighter." Well, that was the beginning of the Boomerang. And at that point, of course, we got all the draftsmen and everybody we needed into the team, and we designed and built that Boomerang, putting it straight into production without a prototype, 5 coming down the line, and we did it in something just over 5 months. I'm not quite sure what the time was, but it was extraordinarily fast. And, well, she flew, and we built 250 of them.
The privately owned Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, known as CAC, was incorporated in Melbourne on the 17th of October 1936. During the late 1930s, political events in Europe and elsewhere made it clear to some that another world war was a distinct possibility. With concerns about Australia's industrial potential, events were set in motion which eventually led to the formation of the CAC. 3 companies were originally involved: BHP, Broken Hill Smelters and GMH. And a decision was made to purchase 30 acres at Fisherman's Bend, Port Melbourne, where the CAC factory was built and ready for occupation in September 1937. Under licensing agreements with the USA and an agreement the CAC could modify the designs to meet RAAF requirements, the CAC's first aircraft to be produced was the Wirraway, generally regarded as an advanced training aircraft. Due to time limitations and the urgency of the project, the Boomerang incorporated as many of the design features of the Wirraway as possible, including the landing gear, wing center section, and fuselage, as these parts were already in manufacture in the CAC factory.
First pictures of the Boomerang, Australia's new interceptor. She was designed and built in this country, and the men swarming around her did the job. This is her test flight made some time ago. Release of these pictures has been delayed for obvious security reasons. The Boomerangs are in operation in the north today, so the story can be told. There's plenty of excitement among the factory workers as she roars down the runway. After all, she's their baby, and from the way she rolls about the sky, she's a mighty precocious baby, too. Back to Earth for a perfect landing. The test pilot pronounced her top the grand machine, and the boys who built her really let themselves go.
With the promise of superior designs and high-performance aeroplanes once the war was over, the Boomerangs, which had survived, could offer little to the RAAF, and the last flights of the Boomerang occurred in late 1946. The first and only Boomerang since the war to reappear in Australian skies is Guido Zoccoli's CA-19 Boomerang, which was rebuilt around the frame of number 206 off the production line and used a collection of original parts. original plane was delivered to the RAAF for service in June 1944 and was then transferred to 83 Squadron where it stayed. When the war ended, it was delivered to Oakey in Queensland for scrapping. Guido's aircraft, A46-206, was originally built as a model CA-19, the last Boomerang variant of which a total of 49 were produced. A great deal of time and effort has been spent over the last 20 years or so by a handful of people devoted to rebuilding a Boomerang to flying stage. Matthew Denning is one such devotee, and he recently had the opportunity to accompany one of the original test pilots, Greg Board, when he was reintroduced to the Boomerang aircraft after 50 years.
You should know where the control column lock is.
Like all new aircraft, the Boomerang was subjected to exhaustive testing by the CAC and RAAF before entering service.
They called for applicants for test pilot's job down there, which I applied for. And I flew a Boomerang down there for my interview. But that was we went to change tanks and the handle came off. Right. And I ran out of fuel in the tank that I was on and had to make a forced landing. It was a rough old paddock, and there were trees at the ends, and I'd completely lost the engine. It was a dead stick landing. Right. So I dropped in across the trees and landed rather heavily. And got away with the landing, it was all right. And the fellow on a motorbike came by with a spanner,
right,
which his little toolkit. So we turned the shaft around and got the fuel flowing again and the engine running.
Must have been quite a shock for him to see a war plane.
Yeah, he was quite surprised to see an airplane sitting there. Yeah. And continued on down to CAC and had the interview, and they repaired the fuel thing. They were very little embarrassed about it, naturally. Sure. And I went back to Mildura. And when I put the airplane in the hangar and they checked it out, they found that I'd sprung a few rivets in the heavy landing, getting it in there, which they had to repair.
Right.
And that was my introduction, really, to Boomerangs.
Mm. So how many would you have actually flown as whilst a test pilot at CAC?
Oh, over 200 of them went through that I tested. And
including
probably
one?
Including 206, this one. Yes, that was well on the way.
And that was about June 44, wasn't it?
It was about that period, yeah.
Test pilot Gregory Board, fighter pilot of the RAAF, on loan to the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. Pilot Board 22 is a great flyer, and he's about to put a new Boomerang through her paces. Not very long ago, Australia was practically without aircraft defense. The government called on Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation for help, and under the supervision of Wing Commander L.J. Wackett, the Boomerang was evolved and in production in the shortest time in aeronautical history. Already she's won her spurs in New Guinea. Board, youngest test pilot in the world, is about to give her the gun. Stand by for action. Straight into the sky, hanging on her prop. Boomerang can execute operations only limited by the pilot's ability to take the punishment of fast maneuvering. Board is an outstanding flyer, and while still under 20, was shot down by a Zero in the Singapore debacle. He indulges in a little unorthodox flying, just to show how the Boomerang can perform. No, the camera doesn't lie. She's upside down. The pilot, of course, is strapped in. And remember, he's doing that in the slipstream of the camera plane. Enough of that? Right. Let's go. She's very fast, but makes no claims to the super speed class. Her maneuverability is unexcelled. She's coming up. The Boomerang always comes back, even if for the moment the pilot is throwing her for a loop. Obviously, the Boomerang's the real thing, and this remarkable demonstration of her flying qualities is something for those Australian detractors of Australian industry to paste in their collective hats. Rolling home, and how? Said a 9th Division Brigadier at Finchhaven, nowhere have we had aerial cooperation to compare with what we got from the Boomerang Squadron. Yes, Boomerang's got what it takes.
But it's nice to sit in one again after all these years.
Yeah.
They're a lovely airplane to fly. But it wasn't a satisfactory airplane for combat. It was slow, it was aerobatic, but it was slow.
Yeah.
It wasn't as maneuverable as a Zero.
No.
And I flew the Brewster Buffaloes against the Zeros. And they had no hope. We were just shot down one after the other with those things. And this had about the same performance as the Brewster Buffalo. Very similar airplane.
It was only a stopgap measure, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Try and get aeroplanes in the air.
Yeah. He was a good trainer for a fighter pilot before you popped him into something else.
But all in all, it was a fairly stable aeroplane, I think, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
Nice handle.
Oh, yes. Very, very delightful airplane. Well designed. And you thank a man called Mr. David.
Fred David.
Fred David,
Yes.
who put all his experience into this and got it from the day it was thought about till the day that the first one flew was 6 months. I think that's pretty much a world
It's an
record.
incredible effort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The restoration process is long and arduous and begins with the fuselage section. This is also the part where identification of the original aircraft can be made if the certification plate is still intact. The cockpit section, rear fuselage, center section and tail group were all bolted together on the original frame to facilitate easy repair. The way these parts were replaced or repaired during service often makes it difficult to identify a particular airframe. Matthew Denning and Greg Batts have set up a workshop in Brisbane where they pool their knowledge and resources, and both have found the restoration process can be hindered by time and financial restraints. The task of rebuilding is often also compounded by the fact that the CAC had discarded virtually all of the original Boomerang drawings after the Second World War. The handful of people undertaking restoration work together, exchange and loan parts to overcome these problems. Restorers of the Boomerang have travelled extensively throughout Australia to collect discarded parts and then restore them back to their original condition, which can often be difficult when the parts have been exposed to the elements for over 40 years. Matthew originally intended to restore his plane to static or non-flying condition, but has since decided to work alongside Greg Batts to restore both planes in the workshop to flying condition. This has meant restoring parts to a higher standard so that the aircraft will withstand the rigours of flying. The wings in particular have created problems for the restorers, as a complete usable wing section could not be found. The rarity and uncertainty of Boomerang parts can be directly related to its history when the war ended.
At the end of World War II, a lot of the aircraft in the Air Force started to be pensioned off, and 83 Squadron had to shed a few Boomerangs as well. So in about 1945, January through to April, a number of Boomerangs were ferried through to Oakey, just outside of Toowoomba in Queensland. There was about 36 Boomerangs that finally ended up at Oakey, which was an Air Force storage depot, and they just sat there in the grass. And by about 1948, the war was well and truly over. These aeroplanes were obsolete, and the order came through to dispose of them. So a lot of the cannons and armament were removed, the instruments came out, the engines disappeared, and the aircraft were sold off just as hulks to the highest bidder for scrap. And so the scrap metal merchants decided to cut through the bolts that held the wing to the fuselage. The whole wing just went into the smelter as one piece of aluminium. All the tailplanes were removed with oxyacetylene torches just burning through the tubes, and all that just went into the smelter as well. Any slag that wasn't aluminium just came off out of the bottom of the furnace. And so what was left was just a lot of fuselage frames, which had had all the timber structure smashed off them as well with axes and whatever implements the scrappers wanted to use. And they were left for sale by the local farmers. Straight after the war, it was very difficult to get hold of nuts and bolts and fittings, and these aircraft were a terrific source of these sorts of parts. And so fuselages like this went for between £2 and £5 each, sold to the farmers who brought them back to their properties, and over time the farmers might cut off a length of tube, as that one has been through there, to fix an implement on the farm, rob it of a few nuts and bolts, take the wiring out of it, and basically the airframes just sat on their properties for all these years. And it was only in recent times where the interest has been to try and restore these aircraft and bring them back to their former glory that people have been starting to collect this material off the farms again. I started collecting all these bits and pieces back in 1975 when I had an interest in old aeroplanes, and another collector that I knew at that stage brought me up to this property to introduce me to Merv, and also his father Christy, who was still alive at that stage. And I was able to take a few parts off the airframe that I needed at the time. But I've been able to come to the point now where Merv no longer needs any of these parts, and so today we've collected all the rest of the material so that it can be restored and it won't just get lost and rot into the ground. Apart from these major parts that are near Merv's house under the trees, there's also a lot of other small parts that are scattered around his property. And over the years I've had various trips up here, and we've just been able to walk around the paddocks, and it's amazing what you'll just pick up off the ground. A lot of useful parts were just left there. It's been quite a significant find today to be able to collect all these fuselage frames. So once we get back to Brisbane, they'll come in handy as a source of reference for where other parts go on my own restoration, and there'll be a few other bits and pieces in amongst them that I don't have at the time. And because there are so many parts here, it's quite likely that there'll be another complete boomerang built up that will be flying sometime in the future.
Dick Hurrigan was fortunate to obtain what is believed to be the only existing copy of CAC drawings of the outer wing panels, which have proved to be invaluable to all those involved in the rebuild of the Boomerang. Living just outside Melbourne, he's also undertaking a Boomerang rebuild.
When I found it at Colac, there was no wooden covering on it. Of course, I had no idea of a serial number. It was just a Boomerang. There was a constructor's plate in it which said it was a CA19 model. It had the constructor's number on it, and I also found penciled inside some of the panels the actual serial number, 249, which, of course, then I realised was the last one built out of the three contracts. So I did a little bit of research and found out that the wings had been taken off the aircraft when it was at Laverton, and from that we found out it only flew an hour 45, which meant, of course, it only did a test flight at the factory at Fisherman's Bend, and was then flown direct to Laverton and put into storage and never flown again. That was February 1945, so obviously they didn't have any need for any more Boomerangs in the islands for combat purposes at that time. And a chap at ARL found out some records of the wings, because they did fatigue testing on the wings, and the total wing time was an hour 45 minutes. So it's a CA19 model, and it was the last one built. But of course, like any restoration or a rebuild in this case, it's really a composite of dozens of different bits and pieces and from half a dozen different aircraft. because I had 6 fuselages to make 1 fuselage, because some parts are missing on others that are on one, and sometimes, as I said earlier, you use it as a blueprint where to put things. The first wing I heard about was in a scrapyard on the outskirts of Kalgoorlie, and then that was in 1965. I drove over to Kalgoorlie in the new Holden and found the scrapyard and got this port wing which had been cut in half with an axe, but it was better than nothing. I had a Wirraway centre section which was virtually identical. I was going to use that, but then a few years later, looking for some Spitfire parts down at Nill, which is in the Western District of Victoria, we found a farmer's property that had a fuselage on it, sitting on a centre section with a half of each outer wing attached to it. And that had come from a gunnery training school at Nill. So it meant that I then had a centre section and the inner half of each outer wing. And then in the early 1970s, I heard about one that had crash landed on Cape York Peninsula in 1943 on flight from Horn Island to Mariba, and the flying doctor pilot told me about it, sent some photographs down, and we could see that it had complete outer wings and the tail assembly. All the rest had been burnt and rotted away. So in the early 1970s, I mounted an expedition to Princess Charlotte Bay to fix these wings up. And what we did is we went by road to a place called Cowan, then out to Princess Charlotte, to Port Stewart, I should say, which had been an old cattle port, where there was cattle yards there and a river, but of course with roads, they'd stopped using it as a port. And we had this 18-foot outboard motorboat, which we sailed down 9 miles down the sea into Princess Charlotte Bay, and we found where this aircraft had force landed, and we sort of cut the burnt remains of the wing centre section away and carried each outer wing back one at a time across this boat to Port Stewart. And they're the only genuine complete wings, but there is a lot of corrosion in them, but at least they are outer wings.
As Dick Hourigan has found, the rebuild process is not only time-consuming, but also very expensive. In fact, the original cost to produce the Boomerang was not cheap. The wartime order to the CAC, approved by the War Cabinet for 250 Boomerangs, resulted in a unit cost for each of £21,254, or $42,508. The Boomerang was entirely a wartime project, and the secrecy of the project was closely guarded, as is normal during times of war. As with many companies producing commodities required for the wartime effort, the CAC factory at Fisherman's Bend expanded quickly to fulfill its orders in both factory floor space, which was increased by 3 times its original size, and its employees, from the pre-war total of 1,000 to nearly 7,000. The company was very ably managed by the forward-thinking Wing Commander Lawrence Wackett, whose vision was to have the Australian aircraft manufacturing industry continue into the future, using as many complete Australian-made products and resources as possible. The original factory site is now occupied by Hawker de Havilland Victoria Limited, who produce aircraft and aircraft component parts. Today, the only evidence that the Boomerang was once produced here is this fuselage, which was purchased in Toowoomba, Queensland, and transferred to the factory. Hawker de Havilland now intend to donate it to Moorabbin Air Museum, where it will be restored to static condition. The pilots who flew the Boomerang still like to get together whenever possible. An invitation by Greg Batts to view the rebuild of his plane quickly became a mini reunion, where they once again could catch up on old friendships and relive their flying days.
It was built as a mid-level, high-level fighter with a 2-stage turbine on it, but it was overloaded with weight for its wing area, and whilst it was quite manoeuvrable, it was hopeless as a fighter, and anything could beat it. A number of our fellows were shot down by the Zeros, and it was obviously no match for it at all. And there was one case when Betty bombers came over at 23,000 feet, and the boomerangs went up to intercept them off Horn Island, and the boomerang could only get to 20,000 feet, and the bombers flew past quite undisturbed. So the aircraft was a failure as a fighter, and it was given to the Army Co-op squadrons as an Army Co-op machine, where it was excellent and did a great job because it had 2 cannon and 4 machine guns, and we were getting a lot of ground targets. And 2 cannon and 4 machine guns is pretty nasty to be hit with if you're on the ground. You had no automatic pilot, so you flew the thing constantly, and occasionally we had flights of up to 5 hours. They were enormously hot flying them in the tropics as we were, and when we came down our shirts would be sopping wet. You could literally wring them out. So after 4 or 5 hours of this heavy concentration, you were fairly tired at the end of it. But we got used to it, and it was normal for us, so we never thought anything about it. We sat there with a pad on our knee and a pencil and a map in one hand, and we did all our sums on our knees. We had to read the map and be able to map read because it was all pilot navigation, so it was hit and miss. If we got bad weather, it was very dicey, and sometimes we did. In the Boomerang, at least we had blind flying instruments, but the Kitty Hawks that sometimes gave us top cover didn't have an artificial horizon. And there were occasions when we were being covered by a Kitty Hawk squadron and cloud beat us, and the Kitty Hawks would come and formate on our Boomerangs. So then you had the responsibility of not only yourself, but several other blokes tucked onto your wingtip in what is heavy fog. As a fighter, hopeless. As an Army Co-op plane against ground targets, it was an excellent aeroplane, and those of us who flew them against ground targets were very happy with them.
The upper photograph here is a photograph of Boomerang that blew a tyre on landing in Milingimbi and ground looped, as we call it, or run off the runway and sustained very severe damage. You'll notice the starboard main plane is practically destroyed. He's damaged the air screw beyond repair and the front cowling and the spinner. But it was flown at the time by Rex Mann, and he didn't suffer any injury whatever as a result of it. These things were very serious because it's a long way to get another new aeroplane, I must mention this juncture, so you didn't bend them if you could possibly avoid it. But it's a rugged aeroplane, as you can see, and it was, this aircraft was restored and brought back into operations again. In this case here, this is a very good photograph of a Boomerang. I've kept it over the years, and this was taken 50 years ago, I suppose, in that vicinity, yes. And it happened to be me flying my aeroplane. And I think it's a delightful photograph. The original had more detail at the background, but it gives the beautiful lines of the Boomerang aircraft as designed by Mr. David and Mr. Bolton. I think it's a beautiful shot of a Boomerang. We operated out of Milingimbi, where we always thought that if you didn't have enough fuel, you could use the sandflies to get off the ground, because my heavens above, they were dreadful, they're sandflies. Everyone even were issued with sandfly gloves and things of that nature from early morning standby right on. Things were very crude, and on today's standards, in those days it was quite acceptable. I feel, and one of the big things that kept all squadrons going in those days was the comradeship that existed from the CO right down to the messmen or the cooks and people of that nature. Marvellous comradeship. Yet they'd go out of their way to do anything for you, and you'd go out of your way to do anything for them. And the loyalties that I'd seen expressed by men working in my aircraft were just unbelievable when I look back. But in those days, I was young, about 19 or something, and the exuberance of youth is a very hard thing to control, but you never win a war without it, I can assure you. We knew everything. And in fact, as I got older in the flying game, I just realised how dangerous we must have been. The enemy didn't know what they were up against. We were so dangerous. We had, as an instance, had one of these folded up, as I'd show you, it comes up like that, and folded up was in the escape kit. Now this item was there for the purpose of handing to any person who came along and intercepted you and you thought was on your side, and it read, "I'm a British airman. I have..." do you notice this? I'll have to get a white stick and a dog. "I'm a British airman. I do not come here to do any harm to you who are my friends. I am only here by chance because of an accident to my aircraft, and if you will assist me, my government will sufficiently reward you as soon as I am returned to safety." It is in Chinese, Malay, Indonesian, Burmese, Tamil, French, Dutch, Korean and Thai. The same letter is addressed to everyone. So that was another part of the kit. I'm trying to recollect other small items, and strangely enough, this kit is such a size, it was issued to me in about 1941 or 2 or something. I've still got it at home with my boot cleaning gear in it. And it's serving a good purpose, and it's still got the number, name and rank on the outside of it.
The Boomerang served with 5 Royal Australian Air Force operational squadrons. 84 Squadron was the first to take delivery and was posted to Horn Island just off the tip of Cape York Peninsula, from where it flew patrols over the Merauke area of New Guinea, 300 kilometres away. To work alongside the Wirraways in tactical reconnaissance and target marking, Number 5 Squadron was moved from its base at Mareeba, Queensland in November 1944 to Bougainville, and Number 4 Squadron in New Guinea was supplied with boomerangs in July 1943. The 83 and 84 Squadrons were delegated to home defence duties. In January 1944, 83 Squadron was moved to Gove on the northeastern tip of the Northern Territory to protect shipping and as a last line of defence should the Japanese invade. Air shows throughout Australia give the general public the opportunity to see the boomerang flying these days. Matthew Denning accompanied Alan Bolton to an air show recently where he had his first contact with a flying boomerang in over 50 years.
We saw the aircraft today go up to about, 6,000 feet or thereabouts, and then dive down over the airfield and go and pull up again. At a sort of an angle of about 60 degrees to the horizontal, I suppose, and I think he did a slow roll on the way up. But Greg Board, when we were flying them down there, and he got used to flying them, he used to come down with a hell of a rate of knots and turn it very sharply, pull back on the stick and send it straight up in the air and do about 5 rolls on the way up. Sometimes with the atmosphere the way it was, I had a window about the 2nd floor overlooking the airport, and I was to watch these sometimes with my heart in my mouth, thinking that he might rip the wings off my airplane and kill himself. But sometimes the atmosphere was such that when he turned it straight up into the air, wingtip vortices would roll off the wingtips. And I've never really seen, today there was a slight sign of one, but nothing like the things that used to happen here. I've never seen it anywhere else, the wingtip vortices in such gorgeous array that he used to send out when he pulled out of a dive.
Air shows are held on a regular basis throughout Australia and attract people for a wide variety of reasons, but all enjoy the spectacle as the planes are put to the test. The planes are noisy and fast, just what the crowds come to experience. Guido Zaccoli's boomerang has proven to be a star performer at many of these air shows up and down the eastern seaboard. Guido purchased the aircraft fuselage and many other spares, which were then shipped off to California, where Sanders Aircraft took on the enormous task of rebuilding the airframe to flying condition. The plane made its Australian debut at the 1992 International Air Show at Avalon in Victoria. Guido has led the way in Australia with his remarkable collection of aircraft, which include the Sea Fury, T-28 Trojan, G-59 Fiat, North American Harvard, and the Boomerang. Flying the Boomerang is normally shared between Guido and Wayne Milburn, who has perfected a precise aerobatic routine which always thrills the crowd. Spectators at the Albion Park Air Show had the opportunity to view other great warbirds in action, including the Mustang and Spitfire. Situated on the southern fringe of Wollongong in New South Wales, the picturesque mountain backdrop provides everyone with great airshow atmosphere. Situated just outside Melbourne at Point Cook Air Base, the birthplace of the RAAF, is an aviation museum. The large collection tells the story of the men who served with the RAAF. Visitors have the opportunity to view first-hand RAAF history. Featured in the display are a number of historical aircraft, including a static Boomerang in its original form. The Boomerang, however, was designed as a fighter, and pilots of the warbirds, as they're known, enjoy the excitement of engaging in dogfights or simulated wartime maneuvers. These flights enable the pilot to experience the planes in flight in the way they were intended to be flown.
Maintain 270, 4 to 5,000. Roger.
The Boomerang, a single-seat fighter monoplane, is powered by a 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp 14-cylinder engine, which can achieve a maximum speed of 480 kilometers per hour at 7,400 feet. When used during the war, it was fitted with 2 cannons, 4 Browning machine guns, and had provision for about 4 20-pound smoke bombs under the wing center section.
Boomerang to Harvard. The weather's pretty poor up here. Keep it tight, keep it tight. Just come around the left, we'll avoid that cloud.
trialling pronounced the Boomerang's performance as a fighter as less than satisfactory when compared to other Allied and enemy aircraft. However, its superb manoeuvrability and good rate of climb down low made it very useful for Army cooperation duties. It was in this role that the Boomerang achieved its fame. Working alongside Wirraways in New Guinea, the Boomerangs marked potential targets with smoke bombs, which acted as lead for the main bombing force. Often returning with branches attached to parts of the plane, the daring of the pilots in the course of their duty became legendary. The CAC Boomerang has often been described as a panic fighter. Rushed into production and flying within such a short period of time, it remains an outstanding achievement against the odds, and it is truly a significant part of Australian aviation history. The Boomerang Story is about remarkable Australians, both then and now. The Boomerang was retired from service very soon after the war ended and was quickly forgotten by most. Those involved during the war remember, and as Australians become interested and proud of their heritage, the efforts of those currently rebuilding will ensure that boomerangs will not be forgotten.